For April 2nd, Good Friday of the year 2021 for First Baptist Church Macomb. Tonight we're going to be looking at the Good Friday text, primarily Luke 22 and Luke 23. We're going to let Eyewitness Bible Study tell us most of this, using familiar images that we've used before. I want to just read the Peter denial text to you, and then I'm going to read a section that I've kind of edited that talks about Pilate that Eyewitness Bible Study kind of uses. And then I'm going to turn it over to the video to let you know what's going on. Luke chapter 22. I'm going to start with verse 54. So it says, "Then seizing him," referring to Jesus, "they led him away and took him to the house of the high priest. Peter followed at a distance. And when some there had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and had sat down together, Peter sat down with them. A servant girl saw him seated there in the firelight. She looked closely at him and said, 'This man was with him.' But he denied it. 'Woman, I do not know him,' he said. A little later, someone else saw him and said, 'You are also one of them.' 'Man, I am not,' Peter replied. About an hour later, another asserted, 'Certainly this fellow was with him, for he is a Galilean.' Peter replied, 'Man, I do not know what you are talking about.' Just as he was speaking, the rooster crowed. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Then Peter remembered the words the Lord had spoken to him, 'Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times.' And he went outside and wept bitterly." Just a basic initial thought about that we sometimes forget. John is the only disciple who makes it to the cross. Peter seems to be the only one who makes it to the trial, and he's at a distance. So we want to be critical of Peter, but as you look at your gospel texts, and we know from church history, from traditions, from the way things were taught, there's a lot of conversation about John and Peter. That's not fair. Many people would say, from studying it, this is the reason we have chapter 21 of John's Gospel. This is why we have Peter being forgiven 3 times and saying, "Feed my sheep," because he needs that. And this is why we have the references in John 21, if you'd like to go look them up, of, what about this person? What about that person? That is not your business. Because there seemed to be great discussion about that in the early church. So just so that you're aware of that. If you ever read John's Gospel and you read it straight through, which is an excellent thing to do, and you get to what seems to be the end of chapter 20, and it seems to be the end, and it seems to be an epilogue or an addition in chapter 21, that's plausible, and I'm open to that discussion. But if that's true, then we also need to acknowledge that this was placed because there were great debates in the early church about what Peter's status was with John. So I know I sidetracked us there, but this is Bible study, and so I want to make sure we at least think about it. I've modified this a little bit, but this is what you kind of need to know about Pilate. Pilate is in charge of the Judean area. His responsibility is to keep the peace any way necessary so that Rome doesn't have to deal with these pesky Jews. These pesky Jews and their messiahs. Throughout history, Pilate has either been vilified or exonerated of his actions that resulted from the crucifixion of Jesus. He was no doubt a violent man. But was he evil or just doing his job as a Roman official? Now we know from history that if you look in the future, after this crucifixion event of Jesus, if you look in the future, Pilate is called back to Rome because he's making Rome look bad because he's being too violent. I just want you to think about that for a second when you think of Pilate, that he is so violent that the Roman Empire is embarrassed with him. Now this doesn't happen at the time of Jesus' crucifixion, but it does happen later, but just to give you an idea. The Jewish leaders knew if they cause a big enough riot, they can end Pilate's career and try to deal with someone else. So there's this battle of him holding on his position and them wanting to get rid of him, and then you have Jewish leaders wanting to keep peace but wanting to belittle him. It's very, very tempting also to think of the crucifixion, the event that in Christian tradition we celebrate Good Friday, if you can call it something we celebrate. But crucifixion was a fairly common punishment in Rome. The Romans didn't perfect it. Pilate was considered to be someone who kind of mastered it in his leadership, but Romans didn't invent it. This happened, but had happened with other cultures before this. The Persians, I can never say it right, the people who lived in Carthage, many other cultures up to this point that were predating the Romans. They used to use this for political agitators, traitors, pirates, and slaves that didn't behave. For example, just to go back in time, in a slave revolt led by Spartacus, and so if any of that Spartacus brings up images from you from movies and from histories, we are talking about that same time period. About 11,000 rebellious slaves were crucified by the Roman generals Crassus and Pompey. So it's not unusual for this to occur. It was the most humiliating, horrifying way that someone could be punished. And apparently the Romans mastered it to make it horrible and awful. And as you've read in the biblical text, I believe in Mark's gospel, Pilate is surprised that Jesus dies so quickly, because the crucifixion was designed to torture you. It might go on for days. There are reports of it going longer. So I just want you to visualize that as actors representing Peter and Pilate speak to you now. I'll come back and kind of tie some of this together, and I'll see you in a few minutes.
I should have just stayed in Caesarea that wretched day. I lived in a lovely palace on the seashore. The city was prosperous. It wasn't Rome, but my life was peaceful.
Have you ever been interrupted while in the middle of a deep sleep? Perhaps you acted irrationally before you could fully wake up. This is what happened to me, but let me start at the beginning. The beginning of the end, that is.
Two men who led lives of contrast were Peter and Pilate. One a Jew, one a Roman. One a follower of Jesus, one who ordered the death of that same Jesus. One who repented, one who did not. Yet during the trials of Jesus, both of them gave in to cowardice.
During the last week of the life of Jesus, we settled into a simple but uneasy daily pattern. We spent the night on the Mount of Olives just outside the walls of Jerusalem, and the next morning we crossed the Kidron Valley, climbed up the Temple Mount, and entered the temple grounds. Jesus taught the people, jousted with the Jewish leaders, and instructed his apostles and disciples. As the day ended, we returned to the Mount of Olives. We knew that the Jewish leaders were dangerous, but we did not know Satan had entered Judas Iscariot, one of us. He slipped away and went to the chief priests and temple guards to talk to them about betraying Jesus to them when the crowds were not present. They paid Judas 30 pieces of silver in advance for his treachery. Why 30 pieces of silver, which wasn't a lot of money? Possibly to fulfill a prophetical passage in the book of Zechariah. Possibly because that's all Judas demanded. He bargained away the most precious life ever lived for pittance. The day of unleavened bread came, and this was the day during the Passover festival when the Passover lamb was to be sacrificed. I guess I was expecting Judas to make preparations since he was our treasurer, but Jesus turned to John and me and told us to go make preparations. He gave us detailed instructions instead of his typical vague inferences. His instructions started with, as you enter the city, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Well, I was immediately taken aback. I had been with Jesus for a week and knew that he had not had the opportunity to make complex plans. The odds of seeing a man carrying a jar of water were small. Men didn't typically do this type of work. John and I found things exactly as Jesus said. We met the man, followed him to a house, and asked the owner of the house where the teacher could eat the Passover feast with his disciples. The owner showed us a furnished room upstairs, and we prepared for the Passover. Well, many of your scholars believe that the owner of the house was the mother of John Mark, since Christians would soon meet in her house on a regular basis. When the appropriate hour came, we apostles and Jesus reclined around the table for Passover like we'd done every year of our lives. But the meal did not go as we expected. The words Jesus used portrayed him as the Passover sacrifice. He even said, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." We should have been stunned and immediately started to question him about his words. Instead, we started arguing among ourselves about who was going to be the greatest. This wasn't the first time we had had this argument, and I'm sure Jesus was devastated that we were still so prideful. Jesus took the argument and turned it into a lesson, showing that the most humble among us would be the greatest. And he backed up his words by showing how he had come to serve, not to be served. I should have left well enough alone, but I continued with a haughty attitude. Jesus turned to me and said, "Satan has asked to sift you as wheat, but I've prayed for you that your faith may not fail. And when you've turned back, strengthen your brothers." I didn't catch his conclusion that I would fail while being sifted. I boasted, "Lord, I'm ready to go with you to prison and to death." He looked at me with sad eyes and said, "Before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times. Jesus continued to talk to us for a long time, just as John recorded in his gospel account. While continuing to teach us, Jesus led us across the Kidron Valley and up the side of the Mount of Olives to a place known as Gethsemane. After a while, Jesus separated himself from us to pray to God. He had often done this, so we didn't think much of it, until he asked James, John, and me to keep watch with him. He felt so sorry for us because we could not even stay awake during this time of extreme danger. I was dead asleep. A crowd of men with torches appeared out of nowhere and came toward Jesus. Judas was with the crowd, walked toward Jesus as if to kiss him in greeting. Jesus said, "Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" I grabbed a sword, hacked toward the nearest person to me, cut off a man's right ear. Well, I had just woken up. I wasn't thinking clearly, just reacted. Now, I was completely in a panic. I saw that the crowd consisted of soldiers and the temple guard, probably sent by the chief priests, elders, and other Jewish officials. They seized Jesus, started walking him down the hills. We apostles scattered every direction. From my vantage point, I could see that the torches were headed toward the house of the high priest. I stumbled down the path in the dark. able to stay a short distance from the crowd. As they went into the house, I came from the backside, and I sat near the fire in the courtyard, trying hard to keep my face hidden. Then this girl came up to me. This man was also with him. It was a servant girl accusing me of being a follower of Jesus. I, of course, denied it. My accent, my clothes gave me away. I denied my Lord at the mere words of a servant girl. Twice more I was accused of being a follower of Jesus, and twice more I denied it. At the exact moment of my third denial, a rooster crowed, and Jesus turned and looked straight at me. And I remembered what he had said to me. And I went away and wept bitterly. In the distance, I could hear them insulting Jesus and beating him.
Why didn't I just stay in Caesarea that day? I had been prefect of the Roman province of Judea, an area otherwise known as Palestine, or Israel. As a representative of Emperor Tiberius, I was Rome, the eternal city. I had total power and control over the province, even the power of life or death. I took a large group of Roman soldiers and made the 70-mile uphill, dusty trip to Jerusalem and prepared to stay for a few weeks. I had most of the soldiers stay in the Antonia Fortress. It's a military garrison on the northwest corner of the Temple Mount. Now imagine me, deep in sleep after having, well, a little bit too much to drink the night before. My attendant taps on my door. I answered, and he motions for me to step away as to not wake up my wife. He tells me that a group of Jewish leaders are waiting frantically to talk to me. The things that he's saying, they sound odd, but he wants to make sure that we don't unintentionally set off a riot by ignoring them. The leader of the assembled religious brass points to a bloody man and says, "We found this man subverting our nation. He opposes the payment of taxes to Caesar, and he claims to be a Messiah, a king." Now, at this point, I didn't really care about what they had to say. The man that they were pointing to was so badly beaten and clearly posed no threat to me or the empire. The charges weren't even worthy of my time. So I sarcastically asked the poor man, "Are you the king of the Jews?" I knew that Herod was the king of the Jews. "You have said so," the man replied. Not a bad answer if I don't say so myself. I just laughed, and I announced to the crowd, "I find no basis for any charge against this man." I turned to leave the crowd, and that's when the leader was frantically scrambling to find another charge. He stirs up the people all over Judea by his teaching. He started in Galilee and has come all the way here. Now, the leader thought he got my attention by insinuating that this poor wretch might be causing some kind of an insurrection, but he got my attention in a whole nother way instead. He mentioned that the man was from Galilee, which meant that he was under the authority of Herod. Conveniently, Herod was only a few hundred yards away. Herod would have to deal with a problem that had no good solution. He was either going to break Roman laws or disappoint Jewish leaders and possibly cause a riot. Either way, I wanted to make Herod's life miserable. He was a pathetic, sad little man, and we were bitter enemies. He was an easy choice for me. So I sent the crowd and their wretched prisoner to Herod, and I headed back to sleep. Now, imagine my surprise when a few hours later, when the crowd appeared and demanded to see me again. What had happened? I asked my assistant, and he gave me the short version. Apparently, Herod was actually happy to see this man because he had heard of him and wanted to see him perform some great miracle. When the man just stood there, Herod eventually tired of his silence and had his soldiers ridicule him, beat him to a pulp, and dress him in a purple robe that signified his supposed royalty. Then, in a sign of deference to me, Herod sent him back for my judgment. As the poor man stood there, weaving from fatigue and pain, I could easily see this was not a legal case. It was some kind of religious dispute. I was in a no-win situation. I was frantically searching for a way out. My first gambit was a scheme to tell the crowd that Herod and I both found no guilt in the man, and that I would punish him before releasing him. Rather than appeasing the crowd, this just made them more furious. The religious leaders were whipping the crowd into a frenzy, and a riot was sure to break out soon. My second tactical gambit, a brilliant maneuver, to give the crowd a choice to release the man or release a murderer, a revolutionary by the name of Barabbas. It was my custom to release someone over Passover, and I was sure whom the crowd would not choose. Much to my surprise, they demanded the release of Barabbas and would not listen to my reasoning. Crucify him, they said. They had me in a corner, and they both knew it, both the religious leaders and the crowd. I appealed again to them, but on the verge of a riot, they kept shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him, crucify him." Their shouts prevailed. I released Barabbas, and I gave the prisoner to the crowd, which was a tacit approval for him to be crucified. Hours later, my centurion brought his report. The innocent man's name was Jesus. He was so fatigued that he could not carry his cross all the way up the hill of death. So my centurion seized someone from the crowd and had him carried for him. My centurion was surprised by the large number of people who supported Jesus and followed them. But they were mostly women or men who posed no obvious problem. With typical Roman efficiency, my soldiers took along 2 other men who were scheduled to be executed. All 3 of them were crucified on Golgotha, Jesus being placed in the middle. As was often done, soldiers gambled against one another to claim the clothing that would never be again needed by the prisoners. I had a notice placed above Jesus that said, "This is the King of the Jews." The soldiers in the crowd delighted in mocking Jesus because of his inability to save himself, even though he was a king. The only one in the crowd who treated him with respect, one of the other crucified prisoners. It was about noon when a deep darkness, like a storm, but worse, came over the entire region. It lasted for about 3 hours. The Jews, ever superstitious, were reminded by the plague of darkness when they were slaves in Egypt. They were starting to regret their actions. The enormous temple curtain was torn from top to bottom, and the Jews went ballistic. Jesus called out, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." It had taken only a few hours for him to die, when often it takes several days. My centurion said he was amazed and deeply moved. He said that he had praised the Jews' God and said that surely this was a righteous man. No sooner had the centurion finished his report than my assistant came to me with another urgent request. A wealthy Jew named Joseph had come to ask for the body of Jesus so that he could bury it. He was in a hurry. He said that he wanted to wrap the body in linen and place it in a tomb before the Sabbath started. Quite honestly, I was thrilled to have this unexpected request. Usually we Romans would leave crucified bodies in place for a long time. It's a powerful reminder. However, since this Jesus had so many followers, I didn't want the body to be a motivation for them to unite or to rebel or to make some secret martyr of him. Having the body disappear was a good solution to a potential problem. So I granted Joseph permission, and that was the end of the matter. At least, it was as far as I expected.
As it turned out, the end was only the beginning.
heard Peter speak. You've heard Pilate speak. And yes, Peter comes back and says, what seems like the end is only the beginning. It's Good Friday. And if you're watching this on Good Friday or close to Good Friday, we need to remember that, as we seem to often forget in Western Christianity, that Jesus taught us that messianic suffering comes before messianic glory. There's suffering that comes before the glory, and we often want to skip the glory and complain about the suffering. The traditional song, spiritual, were you there when they nailed him to the tree? Were you there? Like many of our traditional hymns, well written, well presented, well done, but it always has to end on a happy note. If you were going to sing that for Good Friday, if you're familiar with that hymn, there's the last line, and you may want to go look it up. There's the last line about Jesus being raised from dead. If we are embracing what has occurred to Peter and the disciples and all the people in there, it's not good. And they've lost hope. And they wouldn't get to sing that last line because they don't know it's coming. On that note, I'm going to turn you over to a video. It's a traditional video I use often. It's from the Passion Conference. And the question is, what's so good about Good Friday?
Good Friday. How can one describe such a day? The wrongdoing of all humanity, putting to an end an innocent man, the Son of God. This is the story of Jesus' death by way of a cross, all in one moment bringing death to the bright light of our future. He never stopped loving us, and yet this is the incredible part of it. Our sin stopped his heart. Our sin drove the nails firmly in the hands of God. All along, these were the plans. We told ourselves that we were in control, and this was deemed sufficient for all of us. The brutal beating, the inhuman flogging, the naked humiliation. Heaven watched and saw it all. Our rebellion, our guilt, our shame, erasing the very notion of reconciling us with God, our sin and our debt, overcoming Jesus. Here is our King, obliterated. The enemy laughing, his plans unstoppable. There's no longer the sound of freedom rising. Now God's people are utterly broken. Behold the chains of mortality. Yes, this is what is true. We had heard the stories of old. The lost are found, the blind can see, the weak are made strong. But now we are witnesses to this reality. God is dead. We'd almost believed there is a way of redemption, there is a life of fulfillment, there is a peace beyond understanding. Now we know better. For us, we can say that God is encapsulated in this one realization. The single greatest sacrifice in human history is finished. How clearly we can see it. So what's so good about Good Friday? Just one thing, that the blood of Jesus can reverse the curse of sin and raise the dead to life. How clearly we can see it is finished. The single greatest sacrifice in human history encapsulated in this one realization. We can say that God is for us. Now we know better. There is a peace beyond understanding. There is a life of fulfillment. There is a way of redemption. We had almost believed God is dead, but now we are witnesses to this reality. The weak are made strong. The blind can see. The lost are found. We had heard the stories of old. Yes, this is what is true. The chains of mortality utterly broken. Behold, freedom rising. Now God's people are unstoppable. There's no longer the sound of the enemy laughing. His plans obliterated. Here is our King, Jesus, overcoming our sin and our debt, reconciling us with God, erasing the very notion of our rebellion, our guilt, our shame. Heaven watched and saw it all, the naked humiliation, the inhuman flogging, the brutal beating, and this was deemed sufficient for all of us. We told ourselves that we were in control. All along, these were the plans firmly in the hands of God. Our sin drove the nails, our sin stopped his heart, and yet this is the incredible part of it. He never stopped loving us. The bright light of our future all in one moment, bringing death to death by way of a cross. This is the story of Jesus, the Son of God, an innocent man putting to an end the wrongdoing of all humanity. How can one describe such a day? Good Friday.
Let's close our Good Friday Bible study with prayer. Holy God, we thank you that you are the Almighty. We thank you that though I don't think I understand everything involved, or not even close to even half of what was involved, but thank you for all you went through for us, because we were valuable to you. And this Friday that we celebrate, mere days before Resurrection Sunday, help us to remember that suffering does become before glory. And not that we should seek out suffering, but it's part of the process. Help us to embrace that. And when we are faced with cowardice, as Peter and Pilate were, help us to stand up and be strong in your Spirit. In Jesus' name, amen. Thanks, everyone. Hopefully you'll be able to join us for Easter Sunday, Resurrection Sunday service.